Good morning, Wellspring. We're jumping into our March 15th reading. We are in the book of Ruth, and we're moving on to Ruth chapter 2. So I just want to give you a little bit of the structural layout for this book. In the first chapter, we saw the incredible tragedy that Naomi's family experiences with the loss of her husband, the loss of her two sons, and the daughter in laws that are left behind in this broken family with no hope, with no heirs, no children to speak of. And so we see this tragedy that occurs and how that tragedy is then met with this incredible act of boldness and loyalty from one of the daughter-in-laws, Ruth, who says, Naomi, I'm going to stay with you. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. Where you stay, I will stay. I'm a part of your family now. And so Ruth, the Moabite, goes back with Naomi to Bethlehem, right? And then we get into these second and third chapters, and we're going to see a similar pattern established. We're going to see Ruth and Naomi begin to make a plan. That plan is going to be enacted. Then after that plan happens, the second stage of the structures that we're going to see is that God provides a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz. And you're going to find out more about that as the story goes. And then after that providential meeting, we have a kind of a third stage in the structure that says, let's see what's going to happen next. So we have the plan made by Ruth and Naomi. We have a providential meeting with Boaz, between Ruth and Boaz, and then let's wait and see what happens out of this space, out of this providential meeting. And so remember, we talked about how God is not explicitly mentioned a whole bunch of times in the book of Ruth. In fact, the narrator of the story never really talks about God, but that we have to see God is interwoven into all these decisions, into all these actions. And so here's this incredible loss, this incredibly dark moment, this horrible tragedy for this family. And then Ruth's loyalty is enacted, which God uses and walks with them in that journey. And so now we're going to see Ruth and Naomi begin to make a plan to say, how do we go forward with our lives? How do we make a living back here in Bethlehem? How do we survive? And we're going to see these structures unfold of Ruth and Naomi make a plan. They meet Boaz. Ruth meets Boaz. And then let's wait and see what God does with these incredible moments. And you need to see God's providence in all of this. You need to see that God's hand is at work, even in the everyday, normal processes of human being decision and human life. God is working something together. God is in the midst of it. And God's hand is upon them, even though they don't necessarily recognize it in the moment. And perhaps skeptics might try to explain away some of these things as circumstances. We're going to see God's hand at work throughout this, even though he's not explicitly mentioned. Let's dive into Ruth chapter 2. Remember, we just ended the chapter 1 even with that tragedy, then the loyalty, and then we had that moment of hope where we find out this is the beginning of the barley season. And let's pick up. I'm reading from the NIV, and once again, Ruth chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech. Elimelech was Naomi's husband before he died. From the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just pause and note there. As it turned out, right? That's one of those things where we have to go, okay, is that just a lucky circumstance, or is that God's hand of providence in this? So as it turned out, she was working in a field that belonged to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, and the Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseers of the harvest, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, she is a Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this, Ruth bowed low down with her face to the ground. She asked him, Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people that you did not know. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves that don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth, the Moabite, said, "He said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay, so here in this section we have more hope beginning to emerge as Ruth and Naomi made this plan, right? Ruth's going to go glean. She's going to go get food and hopefully enough food for her and Naomi, maybe some crops they could sell to start to build a new life, or at least have some sustenance, a place to live, and food to eat, right? So they make this plan and they go out, and providentially Ruth ends up in the field of Boaz. Boaz is named here by Naomi as a guardian redeemer. And so one of the things that we have to understand about what that is, a guardian or a kinsman redeemer, as you may have heard mentioned before, is that this person, a guardian redeemer or a kinsman redeemer, would be the person who would redeem a family in Naomi and Ruth's situation. So it'd be a normal cultural practice for a family member to take the wife of a deceased man in their family, to watch over their family, to provide for her, to take the land of the deceased man, to take the whatever might be left over, and then to care for and protect the family, and then to extend the family line so that Naomi's line wouldn't end, and so that Ruth's family line wouldn't end. So a kinsman redeemer would then marry a woman who had lost her husband without children and without inheritance, without anything to really offer, and redeem their life, redeem their family line, and offer them a chance at hope and a chance at a future. And so providentially, they end up by God's hand sending Ruth to a field to glean food from a kinsman redeemer, from a guardian redeemer. And not only does that happen, but Boaz meets her. Boaz happens to be coming back, and he stops by his harvesters and takes notice. Who's this young woman that's working with our other women? And they tell him the story of Ruth, the Moabite, the foreigner, the immigrant who has come from another land, who showed tremendous loyalty and boldness to Naomi and actually to Yahweh, to God, to say, "Your God will be my God, and I'm going to walk with you, and your people will be my people." And so Boaz hears this story of incredible loyalty, and then he finds out Ruth has worked all day. She didn't just come and hope to beg and get a little bit of food handed to her. No, she has been following the harvesters all day with only a short break where she got out of the sun for just a little bit into the shelter, right? And he's impressed. He's impressed by the loyalty of Ruth. He's impressed by her diligence, by her work ethic. He's impressed by her boldness to leave her family and her people and come and stay and be loyal to Naomi and to Yahweh. And so Boaz takes some time to get to know her. He talks with her, finds out her story, and then he instructs his workers, leave some extra um, sheaves of barley left, like leave some extra stalks left over for her. Don't harvest everything, even pull some out of what we've harvested and leave it behind so it's easy for her to glean enough. And so Ruth ends up getting this big group of crops, this big, like an ephah, it says, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I would imagine it means a pretty decent portion of the harvest. And so then he calls her over and says, come and eat with me. And she eats plenty and then has enough left over to take some home to Naomi. So then Ruth returns home to Naomi, and Naomi is just praising God. Wow, you ended up in the field of Boaz. He's our redeemer. He's our family line redeemer. Wow, look at the amount of food that God blessed you with, that you've been able to gather so we can either use it or sell it, whatever that might be. And there's leftover food for me to eat after the meal that you've had. God has been good to us. And so there's this sense of anticipation and hope. So we had this little bit of hope with the barley harvest after the tragedy of chapter 1. And now here in chapter 2, we see an even greater amount of hope as we see God's providential hand providing for Ruth and Naomi and putting them in a situation where potentially there's redemption for their whole family and their family line. So church, press in and hang on. I know yesterday we talked about, whatever hardships, whatever difficulties, whatever griefs you may be carrying, don't forget that the Lord is the Lord of the harvest, and that God is still walking with you, and it's just the beginning of the barley harvest season. And so now we see that hope coming to fruition. We see God's hand at work in Ruth and Naomi's life, and we see uh, God using human beings who are acting with integrity, who are acting with generosity, who are acting with nobility and loyalty, and God blessing that and bringing it together to honor his people and to bless them, even those who are hurting. And so I would encourage you, church, press in to loyalty to the Lord, press into integrity, press into honoring God, and press into hope as God opens up the door for kinsmen redeemers, for sustenance, for restoration, for provision for your life and the life of your family. God bless you, Wellspring. Have a great day.